Vishnu paramam padam sada pashyanti surayaha diviva chakshuratatam. As with the eyes open, a person sees the sky before him, so in the same way the wise and learned devotees always see the supreme truth, the divine, all-pervading existence. I want to say that was a perfect selection for the song. That was great. Now, today's talk actually has 2 parts. The first is a kind of non-exhaustive collection of perspectives around different approaches to ultimate reality that have been around in both the East and the West. And the second half tries to zero in on interactions between sensation, perception, and experience. And again, it's not exhaustive, but it's just, kind of a suggestion. Now, I want to apologize in advance because this PowerPoint, for some reason, is not working properly. And it erased in this computer all the nice color slides that I prepared with long hours. Okay, and I don't know why, because many times I have transferred my file from the main desktop to this one, and there's never been a problem. But this time it's just, whenever technology can raise its ugly head, and I mean, it's just a demonic thing. What can I say? You cannot predict. Anyway, I'm apologizing right now because it's going to look even more primitive than it began with. So, anyway, let's begin with the classic questions in philosophy, or the spiritual quest, which are fundamentally the same in Hinduism. Who am I? What is all of this around us? And what lies beyond, if anything? These are called ultimate questions. And they can be resolved only by self-exploration and self-realization. You have to consider, in order to solve these questions or come to a conclusion, you have to consider everything. Nothing can be left out. Now, this search leads us to sort of imponderables, sort of the intangible part of existence. Unobservables, although we're going to be talking mostly about observables later. Because God, or ultimate reality, cannot be known in the ordinary way. Anything that we know about ultimate reality is therefore only conceptual. So I'm going to use this triadic thing here, and by golly, it's got color. Something happened between my going in there and coming out again. Whoa, okay. There's only 3, this is a 3 marble game, that's all there is. You have the I, me, or the human being, the world, the so-called world, or whatever we consider out there. And then you have some kind of an ultimate reality that we frequently call God. Now, this word God is just a code word for the great mystery, really. And I'll slip into using it now and then, but really, it's the great mystery, which humanity has conceived in many different ways. It is, of course, non-material and a mental, if you want to call it, entity from our side. So how did all of this that we observe come to be, and what does it mean to be? In Latin, the root word means to come forth, to come out of. So already it's an externalization of something else. So how did that happen? How did this coming out happen? All right, this is a question that's been dealt with over and over again. So here's one idea. Everything emanates from this supreme being, yet this is not a physical process. According to Hinduism, it's projection, which is called shrishti. This implies sort of an energetic image Swami Vivekananda was very clear in his use of the word projection, and it is unlike the Western concept in that all was created in a physical kind of a way. So that's one idea. Everything is emanating from this God or ultimate reality that is above and beyond everything that we can observe. Now the other is the opposite, and this also exists in Hinduism. God is the support. It's at the base, the ground of existence. And there are plenty of mantras that put forth this point of view. It implies this idea of a support, implies assistance or aid to the practitioner who relies on this support. So it's an interesting flip. Depends on how you want to look at it, and and again, it's just a point of view. It's not that these things actually exist this particular way. Now, the third view here that I have says that the world came first via some kind of cosmic forces and vast time frames. There are distortions and different emphases in different cultures at different times to this point of view. It posits that our idea of God or the supreme divine reality evolved as our understanding of the world evolved. And there's a good deal of historical support for that. The more sophisticated our understanding of the world became, the more sophisticated our idea of Godhead became. Now, if we go back time-wise, way pre-Western, Roman Empire and all of that, everyone was what you might call an indigenous, or every place was indigenous, okay? And they had their religious views, of course, and they tended to be quite holistic. If they didn't get as far as I am one with God kind of a thing, at least humans perceived the workings of some higher unseen power or powers in the world and in their lives. And there was a sense of we-ness to life and a deep connection to everything else that was going on around. So the circle here sort of implies that it was all tied in together. And of course, the ancient Indian perspective is within these indigenous views. And a lot of this survives more in India than it does elsewhere. So we'll be touching upon that a little bit later. This idea of a higher power evolved all over the world into a myriad of forms over time. Now, we're going to skip lots of centuries here and come up with foreign domination in Hinduism, at least, which began under the Mughals, actually. And the Muslim conquests of India, Indian subcontinent, mainly took place from the 12th to the 16th centuries, although earlier Muslim conquests made some limited inroads into Afghanistan and Pakistan as early as the 8th century. But of course, then immediately after that, or I should say the last century of the Muslim rule, century or so, the Europeans showed up around the 16th century. Now, the effect that had on the more holistic point of view of the people living there was that they tended to nearly abandon the type of focused, insightful, individual exploration of spiritual reality that had prevailed from the time of the Upanishads, and it remained only in the hands, pretty much, of some of the sadhus who were in remote areas that were not so much affected by the foreign domination. The vast majority of people, what I'm trying to get is the vast majority of people ended up turning to a religion of consolation based on a kind of helplessness And this arose, of course, in order to deal with the oppressive situation that they were living under. So what we're left with here is where the human being is relying on God or invoking God, and world does not become so much part of the equation. And this was the view that the Westerners got of Indian religion, because they say, oh, they're world denying. Okay, they would say, oh, they're not concerned with the world, etc. And to a certain extent that was true, but what they were seeing was already a religion that had been greatly modified by circumstances over several centuries. That wasn't the real indigenous view. Now, skipping a couple more centuries again, by the middle of the 19th century, there were a number of movements, particularly in Bengal, but I'm sure there were elsewhere too, that arose to correct what was seen as sort of this misalignment in Hinduism. This is the period known as the Hindu Renaissance. And Ramakrishna was not the only player in that, but he took great steps to restore this more holistic view, while others only kind of expounded it. I mean, they were talking about it like I'm doing here, right? Talking about it without actually doing much to restore it. But Ramakrishna called this wholeness, again, this whole which encompasses everything, mother. And he propounded the view that we are attached to our mother as a young child and cannot live without her. But we play joyfully in her presence. He was very joyful, and the people were so uplifted in his presence. Now, interestingly, today, there are scientists who have recently put forth this view of playfulness when dealing with the question, what is this all for? It's actually come up, they're sort of saying, well, it's just fun. You know, reality is having some kind of fun. Now, I don't know if I don't know if these guys have read, some Eastern philosophy or whatever, but they're certainly putting it forth, and it's being picked up by the regular media that reports on scientific advancement. So, approximately at the same time as, the British were getting settled in India and whatever, there also arose in the West this period that was called the Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment, I will talk about a little bit more specifically in a couple of minutes, but the point that I want to make here is that what happened after that was that God sort of began to disappear as sort of a money-making enterprise. That's all that was left. It was just a money-making. You have Christmas, Easter, Durga Puja, Hanukkah, whatever. These are all gift-giving kinds of things. Oh, gift-giving became a great thing because it was an economic stimulus, and oh, isn't that wonderful? Okay, forget the human bonds that it was meant to strengthen, those kinds of celebrations. Mass-manufactured items replaced handcrafted articles that had used to reflect what the recipient needed or liked, and the person would, the gift giver would frequently manufacture the item themselves and give it away. So stuff began to replace relationships. Now this is at the end, of course, of this period of, that began with the so-called Age of Enlightenment. Now, at the same time, what we call now classical science was coming up in the West. So there's this double whammy, because classical science says, well, maybe it says there's a human being, and then there's an out there, all right? So God is not part of the equation here. And this view became sort of layered on top of the capitalistic model, and both of these came out of the Cartesian reductionistic approach, which meant that dualism reigned totally supreme. Okay, everything it's just those. You know, there's nothing else. You know, forget about this God, whatever. Okay. Okay, here comes. I'm going back again to the beginning of the Enlightenment, about the mid-17th century. So this mechanistic kind of view started to take over in the West, and supported by this dualistic Cartesian philosophy. And I'm talking about this as an extreme objective scientific view because even the observer is not taken into account. The assumption was that an experiment set up in exactly the same way, anywhere, by anyone, will have the same results, irrespective of who the observer is. Of course, later on we found out that it's not so, but this view reigned for, you know, a good couple of centuries. And on the philosophy side, at the same period of time, in an effort to keep God in the equation, we developed a reliance on systematization, categorization, and logic, but at the expense of creating a huge gulf between this God and everything else. Okay, so religion also was greatly affected by this dualism that was reigning in all other fields. And so it hit religion as well, to the point where the really extreme ones led to a codification of religion, and that really stultifies religious thought into whatever the book says, and only what the book says, and thus preventing any further investigations into the nature of reality. God becomes something that you learn about as any other object. And during this period of time, particularly in the 19th century, there was a huge proliferation of new isms that came during this period. And we'll talk about one of those in a moment, but after this came a backlash among people who don't want to simply accept the established point of view, but wish to investigate further for themselves, and those who simply rebel against any official ideas at all. And that was a characterization largely of the 20th century. Okay, so one of the isms that we can look at, and I'm going to pick on one of the subsets of Protestantism, and that is Calvinism. Here's how they interpreted the book. Again, you see, you don't just have a book, you have an interpretation, of course. So, the world is strictly a necessary evil, therefore to be shunned, only partially embraced. And, you know, the world was the domain of the devil, okay? But it was there to provide our needs. Consequently, the privileged people began to suck up all the goods of the world for the benefit of the few. And particularly to be shunned under Calvinism was human sexuality, but also entertainments like card playing, dancing, and even previously accepted adornments in churches such as icons. So they had, I mean, this is quite a Protestant point of view little room right here, very similar. Quite plain. Places of worship became bare structures where the book was read. Sermons were primarily about warnings about God's wrath if you disobeyed or went outside of the guidelines or whatever. It was frequently referred to as hellfire types of sermons. But they did allow singing, frequently without instrumental accompaniment. So that was their one big. So you go to a lot of Protestant churches, they have great hymns and stuff. That's wonderful. So anyway, they weren't the only ones that had these kind of life-denying views. But in the picture here, I'm showing like a little outcrop from the ellipse, I mean, it's kind of trying to include the world, but only not, only the good part of it, where we get our food, and stuff like that. But nothing that's really like enjoyable. So food even has to be really plain and, not terribly creative. I mean, it's a point of view. Okay, so in Western religion, ultimately it became here that if there is a God, it's way up there somewhere. And we don't concern ourselves about it except for a couple hours each week for conventional social reasons. Okay, so you go to church and, cool. Okay, took care of my obligation and said hi to a lot of people, got to show off my new clothes and, all of that. So, thus began the felt experience for many people of isolation, which was deemed alienation by the middle of the 20th century. In this point of view, the world and God are so huge that the person feels lost. There's loss of relevance, of morality, etc. I mean, what's the point? There's the fueling of increasing despair and drug addiction or other ways of opting out of a life of intense suffering. And truthfully, here we are in the 21st century, but these particular social ills are greater now than ever before. So a statistic here, preventable drug-related poisoning deaths or drug overdoses are at an all-time high and increasing rapidly. In 2016, about 55,000 people died from preventable drug overdoses in this country, which is an increase of almost 400% since 1999. So there was a PBS thing not very recently on how this happened. It started out with pharmaceuticals. I mean, okay drugs. But anyway, the point is the alienation. Okay, now I'm stepping back now to ancient India again, and the first real systematized philosophy was developed there. It was called Sankhya. But it's actually, from our point of view, it's a cosmological, psychological, dual path to salvation, release, enlightenment, whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of different words for it. So the macrocosm and the microcosm are mapped or patterned on one another. And affliction arises because we fail to distinguish between those two. We ascribe our suffering to outside influences, but the remedy is to recognize and understand that our own instruments are intricately connected with what's out there. Therefore, we need to achieve control of them so that we no longer suffer. We're going to talk about the instruments more in the second half of the talk. God may be there. There may be a supreme reality, but it's not necessary for attaining the goal in Sankhya, which was defined as kaivalya. Kaivalya meant separation. And so it's interesting because you didn't really need an idea of God in order to follow this particular philosophy, but Kaivalya, interestingly, after recognizing the essential interconnectedness of the world and the I, me, their conception of release from suffering is actually separation of the Purusha, or I, the word that they used, the Purusha, from the world, or Prakriti. So the person becomes then, released from any kind of afflictive influences. That's their idea. So ending up with, and this is kind of what happens, this is the experience of one who has reached the goal on this path, and ultimately other paths within the Hindu traditions. While the person is in a sort of a state of separation, this is what they're experiencing, but then the enlightened one comes back to the relative plane of existence under normal circumstances. This is just kind of a summary statement. In the words of Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj, who lived in the 20th century, and he followed the path of vichara, or investigation. He says, the world comes into being at the same time that the I amness, the beingness, comes into being. The moment one becomes conscious, the world comes into view. The two are in fact one. This is greatly in keeping with the Buddhistic view of dependent co-arising, which has been there for, well, original Buddhism has been there for 2,500 years, but this idea of dependent co-arising is originated around, I believe, the 7th or 8th century. And so the conclusion of investigators into the nature of reality agree, you can't have one without the other. It's just not possible. Now, I think this is where I stop. Nope, there's one more here. So God is a conception. Some people get along without it entirely. Swamiji, that is Vivekananda, says we go from lower truth to higher truth. So we go from restricted or narrower views to broader, more all-encompassing ideas, more abstract ideas. And of course, this differs slightly from one place in time to another place in time. Now, all right, now you can turn this thing off. I'm going to have to go to another file because of the prior technological problem. Let's see what we got here. Okay, so we start, the last slide was God is a conception, and now we say world is a conception. Loka, the word for world, is that coming up?
Just have to let it reset for a second.
Oh, okay. The word for world I want to use is loka. That means a world of shared experience. But it's not totally. So you have different worlds here. You have, depending on where you work, for instance, there's the world of working in a hospital is really different from the world of working in a school, is different from the world of working in a factory. So these are the people who are in those places kind of share that experience, but then again, they're still individuals, and so there's certain parts of their so-called world that they don't share. Is it rebooting or something?
Yeah.
So the question, maybe we'll see a flash of it. Oh, here we go. When a person who's inhabiting that has a particular loka, okay, when a person dies, where do they go? So it's the same, pretty much the same question as where do conceptions go when you're not thinking of them? So I'm going to leave that as an open question. You can think about that. All right, where do conceptions go? So we've already showed that God is a conception, world is a conception. But what about the body? We're still sort of left with this body. You know, this is like the big bugaboo in the whole concept or religious thing in Hinduism. Okay. we are left with an undeniable fact. There is a body and we seem to be it. For the spiritual seeker, it's merely the beginning of, or the locus of the search. A human body is necessary to successfully complete the search. But a body is part of the world. It's food in another form. So the question, is the person in the world, or is the world in the person, or is it both? Well, it's not really an either-or question. So let's try and look at it another way. So now we're going to get into really the second part of the talk, which is the perceptual part. And here we have the primary triad. On each of these lines connecting the perceiver, the perceived, and perceiving, what we can say is, where does it end? Where exactly is the boundary between any of these two factors? So I put a little squiggle here on each of these, because where does the perceiver end and the perceived or the object begin? It's really a difficult question. But they tackled this question, attempted to tackle this question, and they came up with a very interesting thing, back in the original Sankhya. They call it Satkaryavada. This is a axiomatic word. It means the effect is inherent in the cause. Therefore, if the perceiver or doer is at cause, then all the perceived effects are inherent in the doer or the perceiver. You see what I'm saying? We participate in the entire thing. There's no separation anywhere. If the effect is inherent in the cause, there's no change at all. Now let me talk about this a little bit more in terms of particularly some of the Indian folks may get better. That is, okay, you have Prakriti, which is nature, in an undifferentiated kind of form. But then when Prakriti starts to differentiate, you have Vikriti, which is the evolutes of nature. Now, those evolutes are everything that we can observe. All the observables, the knowables, okay. If they were inherent in Prakriti, if they, excuse me, let's put it this way. If the effect that we see was already there in the cause that we don't see, then they are in essence the same thing, although we're not perceiving it that way. Does that make sense? Okay, so Prakriti involves everything. Everything is involved in Prakriti, but as soon as it starts to evolve and manifest everything, then we get a little confused and we think somehow these are separate items. Well, they're not really. They are just ways that Prakriti herself or itself is manifesting to our sensory apparatus. Okay, so this participation that we have is because we consider ourselves the perceiver, because we have the organs to perceive. Okay. Now, interestingly, this has become center stage in science and math circles nowadays. There's this mathematician by the name of Hoffman who says, I am claiming that experiences are the real coin of the realm. The experiences of everyday life, my real feeling of a headache, my real taste of chocolate, that reality is the ultimate nature, is the ultimate nature of reality. in a sense, restating what Patanjali said a couple thousand years ago. Prakriti, or all this, exists for the experience of the Purusha, that is, the real I. So Hoffman has opened, kind of a can of worms here for the scientists to, it's one of the approaches to consciousness, which we're going to talk about later a little bit. So now I want to say, in this triad here, the perceiver, over here on the right-hand bottom, is the perceiver the one we normally consider the subject? Or is it the one who's taking in this entire triangular model? There you are out there. You see this whole model. In other words, draw back from this. You can see the whole thing, just as a sage would see everything united. And we refer to this one who's seeing all of it from out here as witness. And the witness, the sages say, is the gateway to the true subject. The true subject. That isn't part of this triangle at all, but in a sense observes. Now, humans, how do we observe? We have these 5 senses. I want to talk about not the senses themselves, but the sensation. Okay, the sensation of hearing. As he said, the taste of chocolate, the real taste of chocolate. Sensations are happenings, and they're happening now. Matter is the permanent possibility of sensation. This is John Stuart Mill, so he recognized some part of this. The philosopher, British philosopher, he's looking at it from slightly from the opposite side. The sensation is internal, yet we ascribe it to the outside. Frequently, we say, well, it's out there, I experienced this thing, it's out there. But this statement is not proven, whether it's out there or not. That is an assumption. Now, again, in the Sankhya philosophy, these sensations were called tanmatras, and they had different words given to them. It's the same as I just showed you before. But they made them nouns. But in actuality, they're not nouns. Is tasting a noun? Is seeing a noun? I mean, really, it's a verb. It's expressing an action. Something is happening. But according to that Sankhyan system, they had to consider them nouns because their philosophy posited only these 2 categories of existence, spirit or Purusha, in nature or Prakriti. So in their system, since these sensations can't be spirit, they have to be a thing or an evolute. And this system did not explore fully the nature of events because they were more interested in a different question. Their question was, to whom or for whom is the event happening? Okay. Nowadays, however, we're focused on the events. The physicist Max Planck, at the end of the 19th century, established the primacy of action. Einstein came along just a few years later and applied Planck's work to the study of light. And since then, ever since then, happenings have dominated physics, and matter is entirely secondary, totally secondary. Now let's look at sensations in a little different build-up here. All animals have sensations. Reflection on a sensation creates an experience. Reflection here means the experience happened to me. Example, dogs know if you kick them, they'll stay away. Third thing, a collection of experiences creates memory. So the next time the dog sees you, it will still keep away. It remembers. And next, a collection of memories creates a person. In our case, at least, we're very attached to our personhood. But we know that animals also have a collection of memories, and at least in the case of some, they have a personal identity. Okay, elephants, dolphins, chimps, gorillas, parrots. The legal system is now dealing with the question of animal personhood. Remember that the only thing materially that differentiates us from them is that they cannot speak, except parrots. So speaking may be one of those differences without a distinction, really. An animal person is a person that doesn't speak. Now let's talk a little bit more about memories here. Memories often turn a person into a puppet. A puppet does the same thing, kind of can do the same thing over again, or at very least without thinking. It's completely under the sway of its programming. So as a person, is that such a great thing to be? This sort of puppet thing? A person who involuntarily loses their memories is called demented. A person who voluntarily loses their memories is called enlightened. Because they realize that memories can be hindrances to reality. This doesn't mean that the person doesn't remember, the enlightened person doesn't remember that X, Y, or Z happened when they were 5, 10, 12, whatever. No, they remember it, but what they've gotten rid of is the baggage that goes along with that memory. All of the emotional junk, that's been left by, who knows, traumas or, different kinds of sensitivities kids have. So the enlightened person just says, they work through it and they come back to memories that have been cleared of all that extra baggage, so they can talk about things that weren't so pleasant or things that were, without any, usually we use the word attachment to it. Well, yes, attachment is one of those elements, but frequently it's not attachment in the sense that we're so aware of it, it's the attachments we aren't aware of that have been permanently fused to those memories. Now, the word that they use is vasana. That's all the stuff that's connected with a memory that keeps you locked into a not so good situation mentally. That is what the enlightened person does not have anymore. So the final word on this is, by Sri Nisargadatta, there is no permanent person. Once you've worked through all of that, you find a completely, it's like you're renewed every minute, every day at least, I don't know about you folks, but I was going through some stuff. You have to clean out stuff every once in a while and get rid of it, right? I've got some stuff that goes, or I had, that goes back, 20, 30, 40 years, whatever. So I'm looking at some of this stuff, and yes, I recognize it. I recognize, oh yeah, I remember that, sort of, but I don't really remember that. I'm not that person anymore at all. It's like that happened to somebody else entirely. Now, I've got this memory that I can call up, but I haven't thought of it in a long time, but I see this item, and yeah, it reminds me of what that whole circumstance was. But that person has been gone a long time. So, person, like he says, he's not saying there's no person at all, But there's no permanent person. That person just keeps changing, keeps moving, keeps going on. And yes, we can dredge up old stuff, but when we need to, when it's important, when it's relevant. But otherwise, no. So we see, I am a conception. A collection of sensations, experiences, memories, desires, highs, lows, successes, misalignments, mistakes. This is part of being a person. And this is what, like Sri Krishna says, just drop all that. Just drop it. We've made a mistake by holding on to something that we're not. Why then is this so difficult to figure out? So to answer this, I have to refer to physics again. You have to go to the causal circularity of the role of the observer in quantum measurement. This circular logic of the dependent co-arising of the subject and object is called a tangled hierarchy, or a strange loop, which involves self-reference and paradox. So a tangled hierarchy is something that has no beginning point, no end point, no obvious causality. And it involves paradox. Now, this plays right into the ultimate Advaitic, non-dual view of Indian philosophers, because since it has no beginning point and no ending point, do we have a beginning point or an ending point? And I'm not talking about our bodies. I mean our real self. In actuality, the situation is more like embedded holarchies, what they call holarchies. Okay, so a holarchy is a collection of holons, and a holon is both a part and a whole, depending on how you want to look at it. The identity of a holon is not lost at different levels of holarchy. So, for instance, holarchy is not the same as hierarchy, because hierarchy has a top and a bottom. A holon is both a whole and a part. So let me give you an example. You can demonstrate, for instance, okay, you have subatomic particles, you have atoms, the atoms go to make up molecules, the molecules go up to make macromolecules, then you have organelles, then you have cells, then you have tissues, then you have organs, then you have organisms, and then you have communities, and then you have whole societies. But each of these has an identity within itself, but it becomes a part of, it's embedded in a larger grouping. And then if you want to look at it, you can take it back to the smallest level of holon. So it's not a hierarchy at all. It's like a fractal. The patterns go on at one end that can be similar to those at another end, completely far away. You can find the same pattern, slightly repeating, but they're like one embedded in another. So what does this actually leave us with? There's something going on here. Consciousness. We go back to consciousness again. When there are no parts at all, and even holarchy disappears in the final unification, then you have existence, consciousness, dearness, and this is Atman. This is the definition of Atman. And to take it to its final step, Atman is Brahman. So where do we start? For the Buddhist meditators, they focus on a sensation. That's how they start. Focus on sensation. Bring it back, watch it, bring it back, bring it back. For the Hindus, they focus on divine reality in the sense of light. But again, you're talking about, you're heading at insubstantiality right from the outset. I'm talking about Advaitic meditation, not dualistic meditation. So the Buddhists try and get rid of the next step, which we showed in the development of a person, by not even going to don't even reflect on a sensation, just pure sensation. Don't even reflect on, like, who is experiencing it? No. You just focus on sensation, and in that way they cut off the whole rest of the chain leading to the puppet. The Hindus take the mind off of I and mine, and they're kind of bathing in a photonic reality without mass, maybe light energy only. So the final unnamed ultimate reality, they call in Buddhism Nirvana. That just means blowing out the flame of existence. You're not externalizing anymore existence. You're not externalizing anymore. It doesn't mean that the body ceases to exist, but the sense of separateness from the totality disappears. This is the unitive life. All distinctions between these three types of experienceables that we started with disappear. If there's anything left, it's only light. All of creation is only the play of light, as we are. I'll go more into this topic in late December. So I just want to say, this has not been comprehensive by any means. These are just some thoughts on the matter of perception and experience. And I hope you got something at least out of it. So, not a bit. Vidyaprana wants to make an announcement.
I feel almost reluctant after the high flights of union with Brahman here, but I'm going to take the minds down just slightly. This is the season that we worship God as the divine mothers of the universe. We've had Durga Puja, and our next puja is Kali Puja. This will be on November the 6th, not this Tuesday, but the next Tuesday. We'd like to extend a very warm welcome to everybody. If you want to seat a parking spot, the earlier you come, the better. The puja starts at 10 o'clock at night, and it goes to usually about 3:30 in the morning. One of the ways that you can participate in this puja is to bring a present for the mother. The presents must be new and unused. They are ritualistically prescribed. I'm afraid you can't let your imagination totally fly here. That you can do in your own worship, but in this one we have some limitations. The list of the items is in the bookshop, and you can sign up for it. We do ask that all the items are here by next Sunday, because we have to make sure that everything's there. So the worship will start at 10, and then there will be a home fire, Shanti Jol, and then there will be prasad. So we invite you to come to as much of it as you can, and we look forward to seeing you.
Well, the classes go on as usual. Some of us are going to be going off to the Parliament of Religions, and at the end of November, Swami Atmatatwananda is going to give a talk about what happens at this Parliament. So, I mean, he's not even going to let it stew more than a couple of weeks before he lets you know what happened. And next Sunday is Swami Dhyana Yogananda. Interesting topic, muscling it through. And then the following week on the 11th is Swami Sarvadevananda. So other than the Kali Puja, which is big, everything else is as usual. Well, I looked for that. Where's the Ram Nam?
Next Saturday, the 3rd.
Ram Nam. I don't think they made it on here. Yes, okay, Ram Nam on the 3rd. No, they didn't put it in here. Woo-woo. Sorry. Okay. Om Badram Karne Vishrunayama Devaha Badram Pashema Akshabirya Jatraha Stire Ranga Stushtuvam Sastanubihi Vyashema Deva Hitang Yadayuhu. Om Devas. May we hear with our ears what is auspicious. May we see with our eyes what is auspicious and adorable. May we be prayerful in life with steadiness of our bodies and minds. May we offer our lifespan allotted by the Devas for the service of God.